Right. Hi everybody. So I'm Frank Martela, and last time at the SDT conference I was presenting my studies on on benevolence as a potential basic psychological need, but since Rich still keeps frustrating my autonomy to call it a need, I needed to present something different this time. And this time I'm going to be talking about self-determination theory and psychological needs applied on the political level. So let's start with a fundamental question. So what is the ultimate aim of politics? What is the justification of having governments? And let's have Adam Smith answer that. Like already 250 years ago, he said that governments should be valued only in proportion as they tend to promote the happiness of those who live under them. This is their sole use and end. And similarly, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen from the same time said that the aim of society is the general welfare. So we could say that one key justification of having governments is that they should be promoting the welfare and well-being of the people living in the countries. But of course, if we want to produce well-being, we need to measure well-being, because like otherwise we cannot reliably make sure that actually government initiatives are doing something positive for the well-being of the citizens. And at the same time, at this moment in history, I guess we are in a quite deep trouble in the sense that we have reached the planetary boundaries on many fronts. The resource use of humankind has reached the planetary boundaries, so we need to do something differently in the nearby future. So the key challenge for humanity right now is how to produce well-being for all within the planetary boundaries. So how to make sure that as many citizens as possible around the world are having high levels of well-being while we do that in a way that somehow keeps the resource use within the planetary boundaries so we don't break this planet that is the only one we have. And right now the situation is so that actually we're not very good at that. So there are countries where the well-being of the citizens is relatively high, but those countries tend to exceed the planetary boundaries by far, quite much. So they do they use various resources much more than would be sustainable. Then there are countries whose resource use is within the planetary boundaries, but those tend to be countries where the well-being of the citizens is not so good. So no country right now is able to do both of these things at the same time. Keep the resource use within the planetary boundaries while having the well-being of the citizens at a high level. And one key thing that has been when discussing this problem, one thing that has been quite much thought about is this decoupling of the economic growth from the environmental impact. So how can we sustain economic growth while having smaller environmental impact? But I want to challenge this model, because what is the point of economic growth? Why do we want to have economic growth? Because it's not value in of itself, but it's rather the justification of having economic growth is only about it advancing somehow human well-being. So the real question is how to sustain well-being while making sure that the environmental impact is within the planetary boundaries. And right now we have standardized measures for economic metrics. We also have increasingly have these standardized ecological metrics, but what we need is more standardized measures for well-being. And luckily this thing has been now increasingly realized, so there has been much more talk about how to go beyond GDP as the measure of national progress, national welfare. And for the United Nations, more than 10 years ago, they had this General Assembly of the United Nations had this resolution about happiness where they said that the pursuit of happiness is a fundamental human goal, and United Nations invite all member states to pursue the elaboration of additional measures that better capture the importance of the pursuit of happiness and well-being in development with the view to guiding their public policies. And there has been much happening on this front in the last 10 or so years. So many international initiatives have taken place, and through that we have much better, higher quality indicators for well-being of the citizens in various countries. And besides these international initiatives, in many countries there have been these country-level initiatives to measure well-being better. And unfortunately I don't have time to go through them, but you can see that there's across the globe there's initiatives in countries in Europe UK, Italy. There's countries, Mexico, South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, so Chile, all over the world there's countries who are trying to do something more to measure well-being. But then the next question is that, okay, we know that well-being should be measured on a more high-quality way in various countries, but how is that done? How are we measuring well-being right now? And the most standard way of measuring well-being right now is the life satisfaction. So that's something that like most countries across the world are right now doing, that they have like some life satisfaction measure that they use like on annual surveys to know what is like average level of life satisfaction of the citizens. Then positive and negative affect are also like relatively commonly measured. So the argument that life satisfaction is a more cognitive evaluation, but we need to also know how people are doing in their daily life, how much positive feelings they have, how much negative feelings they have. But then quite many like international organizations are also saying that we should be measured this third dimension of well-being. It's sometimes called eudaimonic well-being, sometimes functional well-being, but like OECD, US National Research Council, European Union's expert group of quality of life indicators, all of those have been like recommending that we should, besides life satisfaction and positive negative affect, we should be also measuring this third dimension. But the problem is that we lack consensus on what this third dimension should be about. So actually we even lack consensus about like what it should be called. So sometimes it's called eudaimonia, sometimes eudaimonic well-being, sometimes psychological functioning, sometimes positive functioning. So we should like have like some kind of like consensus more first what to call it and then what to include in that. And with Ken Sheldon we went through these various operationalizations of Europe eudaimonic well-being a few years ago, and we found like 63 different separate elements that have been used in some measure of eudaimonic well-being. So it seems to be like this category that like all well-being related constructs that are not life satisfaction or positive or negative affect have been used like as some measure of eudaimonic well-being. And of course this is quite like unsustainable. We don't get like any progressive science when everybody's measuring eudaimonic well-being in completely different ways. So we need like some more consensus on how it should be measured. And I guess like not surprisingly given the context which conference we are in, my suggestion for this consensus is that we should be like, when we think about this third dimension, we should like conceptualize it as being about psychological functioning, and psychological functioning is then about like these psychosocial experiences which consistently lead to beneficial outcomes like well-being and social adjustment and good life outcomes. And given that, then the psychological needs, of course, should be at the core of what we mean by psychological functioning and this third dimension of well-being. And if we would adopt that kind of measure, that kind of way of conceptualizing this eudaimonic well-being or psychological functioning, that would of course it would give us this clear criteria of what to include in there and what to not include there. So Rich, for example, in his keynote in the first day, he covered these criteria for psychological needs. So satisfaction should lead to well-being, frustration should lead to ill-being. Then when there's like chronic satisfaction, when people have these needs satisfied on a longer term basis, it should lead to some functional benefits in their lives. It should the needs should explain and mediate various environmental factors, why they influence well-being, and finally they should be like universally operational across cultures. So in that study with Ken Sheldon, where we went through this eudaimonic well-being definitions, we proposed this like eudaimonic activity model, where we said that eudaimonic well-being has like two components. One of the is this like more eudaimonic motives and activities, so having like well-being conducive values, motivation, goals, and practices, like pursuing intrinsic goals rather than extrinsic goals and so forth. And then that tends to lead to psychological need satisfaction, and then that tends to lead to subjective well-being measured by positive affect, negative affect, life satisfaction, and so forth. And this is of course like it's quite a general model of SDT. For example, in this recent Oxford Handbook chapter on economic and political influences on psychological needs by Richard Ryan and Cody DeHaan, the model that they proposed on a political level is this, that okay, there's the societal outcomes like well-being, social capital, civic participation, and then there's these pervasive influences like basic resources like healthcare, education, safety net, basic freedoms like self-expression, freedom from discrimination, and then in between those are the basic psychological needs. And Richard already mentioned in his keynote also a couple of studies, so I will not go into details of these studies, but there's like these studies where people have gathered data on like these John Rawls primary goods, trying to show that like when we measure these primary goods, when we measure well-being, then the autonomy, competence, relatedness are there in between, explaining why the primary goods are leading to well-being. And another influential framework is this Nussbaum's capabilities approach, and there's a study also on that topic showing that when we measure these capabilities, again, autonomy, competence, relatedness are there in between. But I guess the problem right now is that, because it's nice to have that kind of studies, but those kind of studies have like these self-reported like the factors, the variables that they have are self-reported. It would be like better to have like these more objective variables of like various national level objective variables, and then shown that their influence on well-being is mediated by basic psychological needs. But in order to do that, we need to have these psychological needs measured in national surveys. We need these national representative surveys where basic psychological needs are represented. Then we can do these studies where we examine how various influences or various factors are influencing well-being through need satisfaction. So without these surveys, we don't have the possibility to link these need satisfaction to objective national indicators, and no data, no research, no evidence, so it's harder to convince any policymakers about why the needs are important. And one of the only surveys that actually has like indicators for like all three needs, which has like these national representative surveys from several countries, is the European Social Survey, which had this personal social well-being module that they've been running twice, 2009 and 2013. And recently we decided to like examine, because they have like data from 27 different European countries, we decided to examine how the need satisfaction is related to well-being indicators there on that data, and also whether need satisfaction would mediate the relationship between socioeconomic status and well-being. And when we look at like need satisfaction and life satisfaction, we see that like, they are like highly correlated, and also that and when we look at the income and life satisfaction, we see that it's also positively correlated, but the correlation is lower. And then when we look at need satisfaction and income together in the same model, where we see that actually the influence of need satisfaction and life satisfaction remains the same, while the influence of income on life satisfaction becomes more narrow and in some countries like insignificant. And here's the same graph for meaning as the outcome, and again we see the same pattern here, like that when controlling for need satisfaction, income and meaning no longer seem to be like, have any correlation with each other. And one thing about these studies is that, what I like about the study is that you don't see like much national differences in here. This is all of the European countries that we included in the study, and you can see like that the effect size of need satisfaction on meaning and other these indicators is almost the same in all countries. So there's no outlier, no country where the influence wouldn't be there. So this like gives some support for the idea that these are like universal needs. Of course, Europe is not the world, so we would need next to have like this global data to have like more convincing evidence on this. But at least within Europe, there doesn't seem to be any big national differences between how strong is the correlation of need satisfaction with various indicators of well-being. And then one interesting study was done like Mark Fabian about like how people are voting, and especially like he was looking at the 2016 election and voting for Trump. And kind of like his model was the idea is that that when people are worried, then they are more prone to vote for the populist candidates, and also like when people are like lacking relatedness, then they are more prone to like trying to find identities from something else. For example, their racial identity goes up, which also like again like influences their voting. So what's his conclusion was that the view that Trump's success was driven by rising racial identification among moderate white voters looking for relatedness. So lack of relatedness was one of the factors that was contributing to this fact that people were voting for Trump. And it was like when people had relatedness, that was like buffering the effect of worry on how people were voting. But the problem, even he used this like this Gallup daily poll, which has like data from like all around the US. And when I was talking with Mark about this study, he said that originally he wanted to also measure autonomy and competence, but there just aren't any like good indicators for those in this Gallup daily poll. So again, like lack of data made him only focus on relatedness, while originally he wanted to focus on all three needs. And then there's like a bunch of other national level studies that have been looking at like this psychological needs in various contexts. So Netta Weinstein had and her colleagues had this one study looking at like civil liberties and women's health satisfaction around the globe, and looking at autonomy there as one explanatory factor. And they used the data from World Values Survey, which actually has this like indicator for autonomy, but it lacks indicators for competence and relatedness. Then Eddie Diener and his colleagues had some studies where they use this Gallup World Poll data to look at needs across the world. But again, like the proxies that they use, first of all, the needs that they have there are not like based on not only based on self-determination theory, but they are like looking at other needs that they as well, and also like the proxies for these basic psychological needs are not the optimal because again the data is not available to give them more optimal measures. And then there's a couple other studies which are look at like autonomy across the world, but then when you look at these studies, the proxy that they use for autonomy is individualism. And of course, in Richard's keynote, we already know based on that individualism is not a good way of measuring autonomy. So many studies have tried to look at this at the national level, but like one key problem with these studies is that we don't have the national level indicators for all three needs. And then I want to like mention like two like national initiatives that have taken place right recently during this pandemic era. So one of them is, of course, this motivation barometer in Belgium during the pandemic, which is like by far the most impressive study or initiative where SDT research has actually influenced government policy. So they were like gathering this huge amount of data, like 100 measurement points. I think it was like, was it 500,000 people altogether that answered the surveys. And then they were like, they were able to like publish all these like public reports from the data. Then they were like had these regular media appearances. They were also like directly advising the government, and of course like then also publishing several research papers on the topic. So that's just one key moment when actually SDT research has had like direct influence on how the politicians are doing decisions within their country. In this case, about how to fight the coronavirus spread of coronavirus. And I will not go through that very much because, as Martin and others have already represented from these findings. But given that they had this data, they were able to look at how people's motivation was developing throughout the pandemic. They were able to look at how people's autonomy, competence, and relatedness was developing throughout the pandemic. And then they were even able to look at various smaller groups. So, for example, examining vaccinated and unvaccinated people, and showing that people's sense of autonomy, people's sense of relatedness was different for these two groups at certain points during the pandemic. So I think that's quite impressive way of actually having this direct policy influence. But again, here it all starts with data. They had this huge amount of data, or they gathered this huge amount of data, and that was the key to them being able to then have these reports, have these media appearances, being able to advise the government. And then I want to mention this one thing that has happened in Finland, this Citizen Pulse survey. In 2020, when the pandemic started, the Prime Minister's Office and Statistics Finland, they started to collect this monthly nationally representative survey called Citizen Pulse survey. And when they started that, I felt that, okay, it's nice that they started that, but they should be measuring autonomy, competence, and relatedness there. And after quite much convincing, quite many conversations with them, I was finally able to convince them, include the pilot these measures for autonomy, competence, and relatedness there, starting January 2022. And now we have, so given that we now have this one plus years of monthly data on the need satisfaction in Finland. And so of course one can use that data to look at these monthly differences, how people's need satisfaction developing throughout the months, but also given it's every month it's a different pool of people, so one can also aggregate the data to get these bigger sample sizes, which makes it possible then to look at these much smaller demographic groups and how their need satisfaction is developing. And just as an example here, here are the well-being indicators that they now have in the survey. And this is from the last spring, and March was the first, March was the time when this Russia invaded Ukraine, and you can see people's negative affect going up and people's optimism going down during that time. But then when you look at these needs, there wasn't actually much change as regards people's autonomy, competence, and relatedness during this time. So that kind of data is also available, and if you have any ideas how to do research on that data, I encourage you to just contact me, because it's now they now have piloted these items, but of course if I want to convince them to do it also in the future, the more research I can show that has come out of this data, the better to convince the policymakers that hey, this is actually data that should be collected also in the future. So please contact me if you have ideas how to do research on this data. So kind of that's what has been done previously, but then I want set up like something like research agenda about like what should we do in the future as regards these topics. So first, of course, we need these indicators for psychological needs. We need to have like them international surveys because like no data, no evidence. So we need to convince various policymakers and survey organizations that they should be measuring psychological needs. So Gallup World Poll should have like psychological needs. World Values Survey should have measures for also competence or relatedness, and so forth. And there's some progress here. So European Social Survey, as I mentioned, they have had like this personal and social well-being module a couple of times previously, and they will run it again in 2025, and SDT needs will be included in that module. And I can guarantee you to that because I'm the principal investigator of this module design team, so I will make sure that we have the indicators for autonomy, competence, and relatedness there. And then there's this global flourishing study which will initiate quite soon, and it will collect this like, quite like something that hasn't been done before in research. So they will collect like 5 waves of longitudinal data from representative samples in 22 different countries. So longitudinal data from representative samples from different countries. So that's something that makes possible to do research that nobody has been able to do before because like we haven't had anything like that happen before. And when I look through these indicators that they have in there, then I was like happy to notice that they have indicators for autonomy, competence, and relatedness there. So that survey will be that survey when the results will come out, they will be publicly available to anybody, and that will allow to do quite interesting research on various topics, including say basic psychological needs. And OECD has been quite influential they had like this influential report 10 years ago in 2013 about how to measure subjective well-being, and that has influenced many national initiatives on the topic. So many governments have followed their advice in how the well-being should be measured. And now after 10 years, they like kind of updated the report, having like a new report on the topic. And I was reading the draft just a couple of weeks ago, and when they discussed their eudaimonia, they mentioned that okay, eudaimonia, the consensus is still lacking on eudaimonia, but then they highlight the 2 areas that should be measured as part of eudaimonia. One is hope and optimism, and the other is self-determination theory's 3 needs. So and they're citing like some of our work there, so it's like great that also OECD is now acknowledging that these needs should be one key target of this 3rd dimension of well-being. And then other thing that we need is like better quality indicators for psychological needs. So because in this national context, these national surveys, the space for items is like is quite small. So given that, they quite often use like just 1 item measures for various constructs. And given this need to have these 1 item measures for autonomy, competence, relatedness, we recently did this we started validate these 1 item scales for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And you can see the items that we used there on the right, and we had like 3 studies, and I will not go through the details about the studies, but just it's currently under review, and just like if you need these 1 item measures for needs, then that's kind of like my suggestion right now that those are the best validated single item measures, basically because they're probably the only single item measures that have been tried to be validated. And then when we have the data, then we should be like using that data for like go through various hypotheses about like what could be the factors that the needs are mediating, or what are the factors needs are like predicting, what are the factors that predict needs, and what are the situations where needs are mediating something. So there's like plenty of potential hypotheses people could be exploring. We know that gender equality is associated with higher well-being on a national level. Could it be that autonomy and relatedness is somehow mediating that relationship? We know that the quality of democracy is associated with higher levels of well-being, and that's one key factor why the Nordic countries have been like so high on these well-being indexes usually. Could it be that autonomy is mediating that relationship? There was like actually one recent study about quality of democracy and political trust where autonomy was used as the mediating factor there. So, and right now the indicators that we have available is like this European Social Survey, and then there's this World Values Survey, we have this indicator for autonomy. So I just encourage you to like take those indicators and you do more research based on the data that is already out there while we wait for like more data in the future. And then just like one thing that could be done more in the future, like now one topic in the well-being, measuring well-being on the national level is that in addition to like looking at well-being on an annual basis, for policy use it's much more useful if you can say that how the well-being is developing right now. And then there has been like these models with combine these annual surveys where realize social media data to look at life satisfaction, to look at like positive affect, So somebody should do the same for all these basic psychology and needs, so we could be able to look at like real life, like social media based estimates of how people's autonomy, competence, and relatedness is developing through time. So I conclude with a quote from Richard Ryan and Edward Deasy, who say that how we define, and I would add how we measure well-being, influences our practice of government, teaching, therapy, parenting, and preaching, as all such endeavors aim to change humans for the better, and thus require some vision of what that better is. So I guess like the takeaways of my presentation is that first, that the key goal of both politics and government should be to improve the well-being of the citizens, and to do that, they need to measure well-being, and when they measure well-being, then the basic psychological needs should be included in those measures. And then the most important takeaway for this room is that I need you to do more research on SDT on national level, because only through that research can we then better convince all the politicians, policymakers to utilize SDT and basic psychological needs when they do politics in the future. So let's do more research on this topic. That's what I wanted to communicate to you today. Thank you.